Report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 58, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress regarding the need for the continued availability of religious services to members of the armed forces and their families during a lapse in appropriations.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, and the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on the concurrent resolution under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the concurrent resolution offered by my colleague, Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, a dedicated chaplain and Iraq veteran of the United States Air Force Reserve. His resolution goes to the heart of our constitutionally guaranteed ability to worship without interference. I thank him for bringing it to the floor. The resolution expresses the sense of Congress regarding the need for the continued availability of religious services to members of the armed forces and their families during a lapse of appropriations. As a grateful dad with my wife Roxanne of 4 sons currently serving in the military, and I know firsthand of the importance of chaplains such as Steve Shugart and Brian Bowman. Specifically, it addresses the issue this House became aware of yesterday, that religious services for military personnel are being curtailed or not offered at all because federal civilian employees serving as chaplains or personnel contracted to perform the duties of military chaplains have been furloughed. This is an extremely important issue for all of us to work together. There is no doubt that the furloughing of personnel hired or contracted to perform the duties of military chaplains is having an effect. Just in this region, church services, baptisms, weddings have been curtailed. For example, the active duty priest at the Navy Yard canceled Mass there. He's needed at Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. It's a larger church, and they don't have a priest there this weekend. At Belvoir, half of the Masses have been canceled. The impact is even more severe overseas, where options for worship are far more limited than the United States. What's more disturbing is that the general schedule of federal civilian and contractor chaplains are being told that if they do come to their jobs, they'll be trespassing. This is just not right. The performance of religious services and the provision of ministry are protected activities under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. If the Department of Interior can permit World War II veterans and performance of First Amendment activities to visit the memorial constructed to honor their service, then certainly the Secretary of Defense can permit similar First Amendment activities. The Secretary can and must allow military chaplains and other personnel, including contract personnel, hired to perform duties of a military chaplain to perform religious services and ministry. In the same manner and to the extent as such chaplains and other personnel are otherwise permitted to perform religious services and ministry when there is an appropriation. It's that simple. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge the Secretary of Defense to do the simple thing, the right thing. Allow all chaplains of the armed forces to be their military and federal civilian employees or contractors to minister unhindered to the men and women of the armed forces of the United States. I congratulate my colleague, Representative Doug Collins of Georgia, chaplain of the U.S. Air Force Reserve, for bringing this resolution to the floor and urge all members to support it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina reserves his time. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I do not oppose this resolution. It sounds sensible going forward. But I do want to raise a couple of process issues. I found out about this 20 minutes ago. And I think it's just emblematic of how much this body has broken down. We have to talk to each other. I don't have an objection to this. I've got, staff. Armed Services Committee has a staff. We work together. We've worked together on the Armed Services Committee better than any other committee in this Congress. And I will grant you that that isn't saying much. But we have. And we just simply have to talk to each other. Why would we spring...
From Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have all heard, we received this news yesterday that our priests and ministers could end up facing government arrest if they attempt to celebrate Mass or openly practice their faith on a military base during this government shutdown, a shutdown we did not want, a shutdown that could have been avoided had the President and Senator Reid agreed to negotiate with us. This is so unfortunate, and what we see is no Mass, no communion, no confession, no prayer, no faith, no religion. But, Mr. Speaker, what we have to realize is that religious beliefs predate government. Government should not be able to tell those who are religious whether they can practice their faith freely, regardless of our government funding situation. What we are seeking is accountability, transparency, and reducing what the federal government spends. Government funding is irrelevant to the religious rights and freedoms that are enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. And some don't get to throw away the Constitution just because they're unwilling to sit down and negotiate and work with us through this process. We're not going to sit here and say, even if you volunteer to serve the faithful, that we are going to deny you. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, will our priests and ministers this weekend, some of them on my post at Fort Campbell in my district, are they going to be arrested if they recite a Hail Mary, if they lead in prayer? I think that it is time for us to pass this legislation to agree that we let our men and women in uniform pray. Let America pray. Government shouldn't arrest anyone because some want to play politics with this situation. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, again, I support this resolution. Nobody is getting arrested for praying. I really wish we could keep the debate here in the realm of reality. I believe the issue is that they have been furloughed in some instances, so they're not allowed to carry on the services. So I don't want that misimpression left dangling out there that somehow we're arresting people for going to church. We are most certainly not, and I wish the debate would remain a little bit more accurate. And I want to make just one other point. While it is true that in '95 President Clinton talked to Republicans, ultimately he did not give them any of the policy items that they were asking for. And all President Obama basically is saying, look, we want to talk, we can talk, but we can't talk about dismantling my health care law, and we can't talk about adding policy riders to the CR or to the debt ceiling, because we need to keep the government running. And there is one other difference, which I know my Republican colleagues will not address. The Republican majority under Newt Gingrich in 1995 gave this House a vote, just like the Senate has given everything you've sent over to them a vote. They voted it down, but they had a vote. This House will not give us a vote on the CR that the Senate has passed. If you feel as strongly about it as you do what the Republicans in 1995 did. Bring it up and vote it down. That's democracy. That's in the Constitution too, by the way. That would be helpful. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
And Mr. Smith, I appreciate, again, your support of this, but it is important because, sadly, information has been provided that chaplains would be subject to trespassing charges. So this does, obviously, interfere with the ability of freedom of speech and religion and assembly. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Tim Hulskamp.
Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, is it really the policy of this administration to make church services illegal, to threaten Catholic priests with jail if they celebrate Mass this weekend? Unfortunately, this policy seems to be another tragic reflection of the complete disregard this administration has for Americans of faith. What's worse, it's an unprecedented denial of a fundamental constitutional right of our men and women in uniform, like denying access to World War II or Lincoln memorials for the first time. This is the first time in 17 previous funding lapses covering 16 Sundays that our brave chaplains have been threatened with arrest if they perform their godly duties. Secretary Hagel must issue an immediate directive that chaplains should continue to perform their duties, and that DoD facilities normally used for religious services should continue to be used. Mr. Speaker, the First Amendment is not some empty words on a dusty, archaic document to be viewed somewhere in a museum. No, for men like my uncle, Father Leonard Stegman, who was a chaplain, active duty chaplain for nearly 30 years, the First Amendment is what you do every day as a chaplain, leading men and women of all faiths. It's something real for the late Father Emil Cspan, who was recently awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama on April 11th of this year. For Father Emil, the First Amendment was not, again, some empty words. It's what he did every day. It's the reason he gave his life for his country. It's the reason he is honored and recognized, and how he drew men and women of all faith. In honor of Father Cspan and all current and former military chaplains and all members of the armed forces, let's strike a blow for religious liberty today, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this resolution and send a clear message to this administration that the rights of those serving in our armed forces cannot be suspended simply to create political and personal pain. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
I reserve as well.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield the remainder of the time to the sponsor of this resolution, the U.S. Air Force Reserve Chaplain, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Doug Collins. Mr. Smith, do you have any other speakers you'd like to yield?
Sorry. I do not. You have the right to close, so I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back his time. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
And I yield to the sponsor of this resolution, Congressman Doug Collins, a U.S. Air Force Reserve Chaplain.
Gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from South Carolina whose dedication to our men and women in uniform is among no peer in this body, and I thank him for his service and for the fight of his family and others as we come along. I tell you today, I rise, Mr. Speaker, really with a troubled heart, but also with one that is on behalf of the men and women in the Air Force and the armed forces and other that are facing something today that they should not have to face. There's no doubt our nation is facing many difficulties, and both we across the aisle can understand that. And the majority in this body is standing united to fight for the future of our children and grandchildren. Those are legitimate fights, and I respect my colleague from across the aisle. These are legitimate fights that we are having here. However, today as I stand, I came to this body also looking for practical things and looking for things that amaze me at times, and this is one that does. But as we do and as we fight for others, we must ensure that the basic rights of all Americans are protected and do not fall victim to the political theater occurring in this body. Military personnel and their families make sacrifices that many of us cannot fathom, and they do so to protect the freedom that we take far too often for granted. Because of their sacrifice, our nation is a beacon of hope to the dark corners of the world where freedom of speech and religion exist only in fairy tales. Yet today, military chaplains who have been contracted to come to bases face a closed door. They cannot go, even if they wanted to volunteer, to practice their faith on these bases during a lapse of appropriations. Each of us in this body across the nation should pause for a moment to consider. Think about what I just said. If a chaplain wants to minister, a contract chaplain wants to minister to a military member stationed abroad who has no access to a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, they would be in violation of the law. I'm a military chaplain, and this breaks my heart. Too often we come to this floor and we talk in abstracts. We talk about concepts, political jargon, arguing about problems that only matter probably within less than 3 miles of this building. But today is different. Today we stand with one resounding voice to tell our service members in the chaplaincy that we will not stand for their First Amendment rights to be violated because the leaders of the other body want to make a point. The laws of this nation require the federal government to ensure military personnel can express their faith or non-faith in all corners of the world.
That is why the military chaplaincy exists, and the need for those that when we cannot serve, we contract with others who can provide that basis of their faith. General George Washington issued an order on July 9, 1776, providing through the Continental Congress for a chaplain for each regiment, stating, "The blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially so in times of public distress and danger." The administration is apparently unsatisfied with denying veterans access to memorials, unsatisfied with closing off unmanned scenic overlooks to motorists. Now they must go after, in the words of George Washington, the blessing and protection of heaven for our military families. The body has seen its share of political discord and policy disagreements. The government has experienced numerous lapses in appropriations over the decades, but never before in the history of this nation have the military chaplains and those that they contract with to serve our military personnel been prevented from meeting the religious and spiritual needs of our service members. As a chaplain, I lived and worked alongside men and women in Iraq. Many were religious and many were not. But my purpose was to ensure that they were able to express their First Amendment rights however they wished. Military chaplains must be allowed, and their contract counterparts must be allowed to provide religious service and ministry regardless of our nation's fiscal state. If the administration wants to play games and score points through unnecessary theatrics, so be it. But I will not stand by and let these games occur at the expense of basic rights of our men and women in uniform. During this lapse in funding, active duty chaplains are permitted to continue serving military personnel. However, there's a chronic shortage of active duty chaplains, particularly for Catholic and Jewish faiths. For example, roughly 25% of the military ascribe to the Catholic faith, but yet Catholic priests make up only 8% of the chaplain corps. That means that approximately 275,000 men and women in uniform and their families are served by only 234 active duty priests, thus the need to have contract chaplains. Due to this shortage of active duty chaplains, it is extremely common for the government to employ chaplains via contract to ensure the spiritual needs of all our military members are met. Will the government shut down contract members of the chaplain corps on military bases worldwide are not permitted to work, not even permitted to volunteer, even if they're the only chaplain on base? As my friend from South Carolina and others have mentioned, the restrictions on basic freedoms that are being had around here and just within this area, at Langley, at the Navy Yard, at Fort Belvoir, these are all areas in which these have already been cut back, and that is a shame. I'm grateful to my colleagues who joined me this morning and the House leadership for their commitment to ensuring that military chaplains are able to serve the men and women of our armed forces. If this body does not pass this legislation, the ability of military personnel and their family to worship and participate in religious ceremonies will continue to be at great risk. I ask all my colleagues to join me in protecting the First Amendment rights of those who give their lives to protect ours. And before I close, I agree that many times we haven't communicated, and we don't communicate as many would want us to. But I've also heard that timing was a problem here, and that we should have saw this coming. Well, let me just say timing should never be a hindrance to this body protecting the First Amendment rights of any of our citizens, and especially our military personnel. In fact, this should be our highest calling and the thing we run to this floor to discuss. And should we have seen it coming? I tell you, what saddens me is I would have never believed that the administration or anyone else would deem protecting a constitutional right as non-essential. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from South Carolina.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from South Carolina yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 58? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking a vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.